Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked on Wolves. Today on the show, a final prediction for the Wolves Suns series. I'll also talk about my biggest key to the Wolves if they're going to pull the series out, or frankly, if they're going to lose it in a devastating fashion. There's one player that's the linchpin to this series. I also want to talk about some bold predictions. A Wolves player that I think will have a monster game at some point in this series, and some other rotation related things that I'm going to predict will happen over the course of the series against the Suns. It's all upcoming. Welcome in. You are Locked on Wolves.
You are Locked on Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome into the Locked on Wolves podcast, part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked on Wolves. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed. That's $150, win or lose. Visit FanDuel.com/locked on to get started. Happy Friday, everybody. Happy weekend and happy start of the series. It's time to get this thing underway. We've been talking about it since Sunday or Monday's show, I guess. And game one is tomorrow, Saturday afternoon, 2:30 Central, Target Center. Exciting stuff. We're finally there. One last kind of preview show for you today. Hopefully you had a chance to check out the crossover episode I did on Thursday with Brendan Clean of Locked on Suns. That was a ton of fun. Great insight on the Suns. And I gave my prediction at the end of that show. I'm going to revisit the prediction. I'm going to talk about some bold predictions. I want to start with the number one key to the series, which Brendan and I talked a little bit about, but I want to get a little more in depth on that. So packed show here today. Of course, we'll have a postcast for you following Saturday's game as well. And then I'll be back on Monday as well to give my thoughts on the, I guess, in the aftermath of whatever happens in game one. So lots upcoming here this weekend as well. First off, a big thank you for making Locked on Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere. That includes YouTube as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. Wherever you like to listen to podcasts, you can find Locked on Wolves. You can also watch on the Locked on Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. And you can follow on X at Locked on T-Wolves and also at Beecken with two B's, two E's, C-K-E-N. All right, if you're watching on YouTube, obviously in a little bit of a different location for the show today, different room in the house here for a couple of days here. So bear with me as my background has changed a little bit and the lighting actually. But anyway, all right. So let's start here. We've covered really in depth in the weeds numbers, frankly, is probably the best way to say it over the past few days. And there's a number of areas that the Wolves, basically things couldn't go much worse than they did in the season series, right? The Wolves will not lose the turnover battle by a -15 as they did over the course of 3 regular season matchups against the Suns. As it turns out, the Suns actually turn it over at a higher clip over the course of the entire regular season than Minnesota does, which was surprising to me. They also force less turnovers defensively than Minnesota does. So that was kind of fluky, right? I don't think Phoenix is going to shoot anywhere near the level they did over those 3 games of the regular season. I think certainly the free throw battle, the battle on the glass, those things are going to matter. And perhaps those are things that Minnesota overperformed in those categories in the regular season. But there's just a lot of things that I think are more regular season noise. But to me, what happened in game 82 that was perhaps most concerning and most relevant to the playoffs is not necessarily Anthony Edwards and the Suns loading up on Ant. And Brendan and I talked about this on Thursday's show. There's certainly a level of hey, Ant's seen this coverage before. He's beaten this coverage before. The Wolves have enough talent around Ant that if he just makes the right read, the Suns aren't going to be able to essentially dedicate 3 guys to Ant for the entirety of a series. It's not a sustainable thing. It might work in, certain possessions, and in this case, over the course of a game. But now the Wolves have had 6 days to study, hey, Ant, here's what you should have done here. Here's what you should have done there. This is how we need to scheme to beat this defense. I'm not worried about Ant, and I said as much to Brendan on Thursday. Karl-Anthony Towns is going to be the key to this series. And I mean, I've been a cat defender for basically the entirety of his career. And I think this is one of those situations where all of the above could be true, right? Cat gets a lot of flack for a lot of things. A lot of it is fair, right? Like Karl-Anthony Towns should be more consistent in a lot of areas. He shouldn't flail so much. He shouldn't hook so much on both ends of the floor. He shouldn't complain to the officials all the time. But they're all still things that he does. And I said this to Brendan as well. I think Cat's gotten a bad rap for how he's played in the postseason. I think he's had some really good games and some really bad games and not a lot in between. But people never remember seemingly the good games. This is an absolute microscope series for Karl-Anthony Towns. And I say that knowing that it's kind of a scary proposition for Timberwolves fans because Cat hasn't been consistent over the course of the playoffs. And he, the 2 games he played post knee injury this year, including the one against the Suns, were not good games for Karl-Anthony Towns. There were moments that were good on Friday against Atlanta, certainly, but Sunday was an awful game against Phoenix. And how much of that is Cat reverting to old habits versus rust versus pressure versus some combination of all of the above? But Karl-Anthony Towns is the key to the series for a couple of reasons. One, because Kevin Durant's going to guard Karl-Anthony Towns. Kevin Durant drew 2 offensive fouls on Cat on Sunday. Grayson Allen drew another one. Cat committed 4 fouls, and he had, I think, 5 turnovers. 4 of the fouls were or 3 of the 4 fouls were offensive fouls, and 3 of his 5 turnovers were offensive fouls. Durant is a master at drawing offensive fouls. He's also long enough to bother Karl-Anthony Towns and bother his jumper on the perimeter and be physical enough and goad him enough that like, hey, I could draw this offensive foul. Like we saw that Sunday, right? That scares me. On the flip side, like Cat didn't regularly guard Durant on Sunday, but I think that may be where the Wolves land and maybe where they need to land to at least try and slow down Durant with a big body. Now, I don't see how Cat gets through a game, much less a series, without getting into major foul trouble if he's guarding KD and KD's guarding him, because Durant's just savvier. He's more athletic. Even at, well, I guess maybe not anymore, but he's longer, right? Like there's a lot of things that Durant does, and of course the savvy and the playoff experience, and frankly, this does matter. The respect of the officials is going to play into this. And Karl-Anthony Towns has to play within himself, not get caught up too much in the emotions of the moment, and play consistently the way that he has for stretches and sometimes longer stretches over the course of his career, but to play within himself, to play more of one of the things we didn't see Sunday is we didn't see him in a spot up role. We saw him force some mid-range jumpers. We saw him be a little bit aggressive, off the dribble, but we didn't see him in a spot up role as much. And I know the 3 wasn't falling, Friday against Atlanta. But the Wolves aren't going to win the series if Karl-Anthony Towns isn't launching, 5-6 threes per game. Like they're just not. They need to shoot a ton of threes in the series, and Karl-Anthony Towns is their best shooter. He's their best catch and shoot shooter. He's their best shooter, period. And he's going to be key in this series if he can stay out of foul trouble. He's also going to need to impact the glass. And the other thing is the Wolves, if they're going to end up playing small, because Phoenix will, like as much as Yusuf Nurkic has played extremely well against the Wolves this year, Phoenix loves to play small. They like to put Kevin Durant at the 5. And Drew Eubanks had some nice moments. I think it was the first game against the Wolves, but like Brendan and I talked about this Thursday too. He probably doesn't see heavy minutes in this series. He's just isn't it's a matchup problem for the Suns, not quite to the level of Kyle Anderson being a problem for the Wolves in this matchup against Phoenix. But the Suns may very well say, hey, let's play small and make them play big against us. And I think the Wolves will try and play big against the small Suns lineup. It may or may not work. If it doesn't work, Chris Finch will have to adjust. And the Wolves' best quote-unquote small ball lineup would be to put Karl-Anthony Towns back at the 5. We'll talk a little more about Kyle Anderson later in the show. There's a chance Kyle Anderson plays some 5 and guards Kevin Durant in that scenario, and probably a pretty good chance. But I'd rather have Cat on the floor because I think he can provide 70% of the resistance against Kevin Durant that Kyle Anderson can, with actually more length, or at least more height. I guess not necessarily more length, more height, and is, 1,000 times the offensive player, certainly the floor stretcher as Kyle Anderson. So I think it gives you enough offense then to be potent if Cat's at the 5 versus if Slow-Mo's at the 5. You're limiting yourself offensively. So I think the likelihood of the Wolves playing small lineups means they're going to lean on Karl-Anthony Towns and Naz Reid. And the matchup against Kevin Durant directly is going to be key as well. And Karl-Anthony Towns has to be the Karl-Anthony Towns that has been on multiple NBA teams, has been a, 3 or 4 time All-Star, and he's got to shoot threes. He has to shoot threes. But the number one thing is staying within himself. Turnovers aren't great. I'd rather him turn the ball over trying to make the right basketball play than being out of control and hooking guys and off-arming guys and running guys over. I would rather I know it's a live ball turnover, but I'd rather him be making the right play than to get sucked into this, drawn into the web of Kevin Durant, forcing him or, goading him into committing offensive fouls. All right. I want to talk about some bold predictions for this series, which maybe aren't that bold, but they're just kind of like off the wall. They're not. I've talked a lot about Cat this week. We've talked a lot about Ant this week. Talked a lot about broadly the numbers between these two teams. I want to talk some specifics about some specific players and give some specific predictions for the Wolves Suns series. We'll do all of that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our new friends at Yahoo Finance. The show is sponsored by Yahoo Finance. Let's get straight to the point. You want to grow your portfolio to deal with the rising costs of inflation, to pay off your debt or your mortgage, pretty much anything standing in the way of you and financial freedom. With Yahoo Finance, you can get access to the news, data, and tools that you need in order to help reach that financial freedom. For more than 25 years, Yahoo Finance has been the brand behind every great investor. Whether you're a seasoned investor or looking for that extra guidance, Yahoo Finance gives you all the tools and data that you need in one place. They are the #1 finance destination, producing a holistic look at the financial news cycle, including breaking news, original editorial perspectives, analyst ratings, independent research, customizable charts, and so much more. Securely link your brokerage accounts for a unified view of your wealth, including 401k and other investments. A comprehensive perspective is what sets apart great investors, and it's how Yahoo Finance ensures you have the insight to look at your wealth in its entirety. With a community of over 90 million users each month, their real strength is helping you on your way to financial success. For comprehensive financial news and analysis, visit the brand behind every great investor, yahoofinance.com. It's the #1 financial destination, yahoofinance.com. That's yahoofinance.com. Today's episode is also brought to us by our title sponsors of the show today. That's FanDuel. It's playoff time in the NBA and in the NHL. Baseball's in full swing. We're nearly 3 weeks into baseball, and FanDuel is your place to bet on every game. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed. That's $150, win or lose. You can bet on everything from slap shots to home runs to slam dunks, all in an app that's safe, secure, and easy to use. We talked about the line. FanDuel's line right now is Minnesota -1.5 on Saturday in game 1. For the series, they're actually slight underdogs. I think they're +110 for the series against Phoenix. So I thought that was interesting. The Wolves are game 1 favorites, but underdogs for the series, according to FanDuel. What are you waiting for? Head on over to FanDuel. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make your first bet an automatic win. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Do you watch Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day? If so, no doubt you have to turn down the volume with all the shouting. Instead, make the switch to Locked On Sports today. It's a free 24/7 sports streaming channel program for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. All right, let's talk some, I guess, bold-ish predictions here for Wolves Suns. And, just kind of like quick reset of the week. I mean, we've talked about the well, I guess I did this kind of at the top of the show about the Wolves needing to win the turnover battle, at least be competitive there. I also talked a little bit about how the Wolves need to play in transition a lot in this series. The Phoenix has been really good defensively over the past really 2 months-ish. And the Wolves, of course, had their worst offensive rating in a game of the season in their 97-87 loss just a couple of weeks ago, but had a couple of pretty good offensive games overall. It's just they were so bad defensively in those other two, games 1 and 3 of the season series, right? They need to get out in transition and score in transition. It's one of the few things they did well in the first matchup against Phoenix. Ant in particular, that could get him going offensively. Of course, he struggled Sunday, so I think that would be huge. In terms of specific predictions, my favorite one is this. I think Nickeil Alexander-Walker will have at least, well, I'm not going to say at least one. I'll say one. I'll say he has a 20-plus point game in a Wolves win in this series. And I think he's going to be kind of, you want to talk about actual X factors. I use the term X factor talking about Cat, I think yesterday, and I realized that isn't probably the right term for a guy who's a all NBA caliber player. I think the true X factor, if you're talking like bench guy or non-star player in this series, could be Nickeil Alexander-Walker. And I know a lot of people are talking about Nas and the Wolves bench versus the Phoenix bench and Royce O'Neal and stuff like that. But Nickeil Alexander-Walker to me is fascinating in this series. I don't think he played enough on Sunday in the game 82 loss to the Suns. And for some context, for how rare this would be, Nickeil had 3 games all season of 20 or more points, and he was the only player on the Wolves that played in all 82 regular season games. The only one. He had his last 20-plus point game. Actually, no, I'm looking at this backwards. He had one actually just a couple weeks ago against Washington. He had 23 points. He had 28 points against the Clippers on March 12th, and his only other 20-plus point game came way back in November against Utah, November 30th, against his former team, the Utah Jazz. So a rare occurrence for Nickeil to score 20-plus points. He only had 4 or more three-point makes in a game 5 times this year. 6 times. Twice he got to 5 made threes in a game. If he scores 20 points, I'm going to say he makes at least 4, probably 5 threes. And one of the reasons why I think he could play a big role and why he'll have at least one big game. First of all, the Wolves bench is so much deeper than Phoenix's, and I think he's just going to have some good matchups, given who Phoenix has to try it out there as part of the rotation, even in the playoffs. But the main reason is that I think the Wolves are going to do some damage from the corners. Phoenix had the best opponent's corner three-point percentage against this season. Opponents shot just 36% from the corners. There's a lot of luck involved to bad opponent corner three-point shooting, because a lot of times those corner threes, those are going to be more open than above the break threes in general. Because usually if you're getting a corner three, it's off some sort of action where you're getting the ball back to the weak side, or it's in transition. Guys are running to the corners. Corner three contests typically aren't as strong as above the break contests. And while there is an art to trying to suppress an opponent's three-point percentage, I think the corner thing is a bit flukier. Which, by the way, actually, to back up that point a little bit here, is Phoenix was actually 21st in non-corner opponent three-point shooting percentage. So opponents actually shot better from above the break against Phoenix than they did from the corners. And it's not scheme related, because Phoenix was middle of the pack in terms of the rate that they gave up corner three attempts. So maybe a more concise way to say this is Phoenix gave up corner three attempts at a league average rate, essentially. But they had the league's opponents shot the worst three-point percentage against Phoenix than any other team. So there was a lot of luck there. Minnesota is top 10 in three-point attempts from the corners. They're actually 8th in the league in three-point corner attempts, and they're 5th in corner three-point percentage. And Nickeil Alexander-Walker, to me, is the best mix of volume from the corners and success from the corners. The only players that attempted corner threes at a higher rate on the Wolves would be Jaden McDaniels and Jordan McLaughlin. I'm not going to count Kyle Anderson because, I guess the rate will do it there because he doesn't shoot that many. Almost all of Slomo's three-point attempts are from the corners. McDaniels and McLaughlin are the only other ones, and McLaughlin's probably going to have a minor impact on the series. McDaniels obviously has to shoot the ball well, and I guess he would be another, you could call him an X factor, but he's going to play a major role. Alexander Walker shot 47% of his three-point attempts from the corners, and he was 45% from the corners this season, which was the best mark of anybody on the Timberwolves, besides Shake Milton, who played less than half the season and wasn't in the rotation when he left. So Nah had the best corner three-point percentage, 45%, and nearly half of his three-point attempts come from the corners. Phoenix will give up corner looks. The Wolves will get them if they run in transition. They'll get them if they put Cat at the nail, which I talked about on the show the other day, actually both Wednesday and Thursday. If Karl-Anthony Towns is in the middle of the floor facilitating, if Rudy's short rolling and kicking to the corners, Nickeil Alexander-Walker is going to be there and he's going to knock him down. He's going to be a big factor in the series, and I think the Timberwolves will win a game basically because Alexander Walker has a 20-plus point performance in said game. That's my favorite prediction for the series. Keep an eye out for that. I have a couple more. Let's do this one first. Let's do slow-mo. Actually, I'm going to split slow-mo in two. Let's start here. I think this is a little bit of a bold prediction. I think slow-mo will eventually be the odd man out in this series in the rotation. And maybe it's only for a half. I don't know that he's ever going to have a complete DNP CD, but I think he's going to find his way where he's basically not in the rotation for a period of time in this series. The only way he's impactful in the series, in my opinion, is if the Wolves end up playing a ton of small ball and he's playing the 5 and he's guarding Kevin Durant, or he's, I guess if maybe he's on the floor with Nas or Cat and he's technically playing the 4, but he's also running some offense and defensively as the 5 because he's guarding Durant. I think that's possible. I think we see him and Cat in the front court or him and Nas in the front court, and Slow-Mo's the one that's guarding Durant, who in this scenario would be the 5 for Phoenix. So that to me is the only way he's going to have a positive impact. Otherwise, he's like, I don't love him guarding Kevin Durant, period, but he's got the ability to do it. I don't think he can stay in front of Devin Booker. I don't think his value as a team defender matters as much in the series. And clearly offensively, with some of the other, with Jaden McDaniels not making threes and with the Suns loading up the way they do on Ant, the Suns were happy to let Kyle Anderson shoot 9-foot push shots, right? And he made his first 2 on Sunday, then missed 3 or 4 in a row, and they all came at really inopportune times, and the Wolves were trying to get back into the game. The Suns are happy to do that. This is a rough matchup for Kyle Anderson, and he is a good player, and if the Wolves advance and they play Denver in the second round, he's going to be really important against the Denver Nuggets, or if Denver gets upset or whatever, which won't happen. But in the second round, Slow-Mo will be no matter who they play, it'll be a better matchup than this matchup against Phoenix. So if the Wolves end up playing small, you may see him on the floor, but because the spacing is going to be so important in this series and trying to alleviate some of the pressure on Anthony Edwards, that means more Alexander Walker minutes. It means more Naz Reid minutes. And I mean, both Jordan McLaughlin and Monte Morris are better 3-point shooters than Kyle Anderson. Spacing is going to be key. And Rudy would be the only guy that's playable that doesn't shoot threes for the Wolves. So, I don't know how Kyle Anderson I don't think he's playing 20 minutes a game in this series. Now, that's not the bold prediction. The bold prediction, and I recognize this is unlikely, and we're going to talk a little bit more about coaching here in a minute, but Slow-Mo's minutes should be reduced in this series, and there is a chance, I believe, that he will be out of the rotation at some point over the course of this series. All right, I want to give a couple coaching thoughts and then my overall prediction for the series. I'm going to try and give something of a game-by-game prediction. That, I don't know, it's weird, but I'm going to try it. So we'll do all that here next. That's how we'll close out the show today. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our friends at LinkedIn. When you're hiring for your small business, you want to find quality professionals that are right for the role. That's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs has the tools to help find the right professionals for your team faster and for free. LinkedIn isn't just a job board. LinkedIn helps you hire professionals that you can't find anywhere else, even those who aren't actively searching for a new job, but might be open to the perfect role. In a given month, over 70% of LinkedIn users don't visit other leading job sites. So if you're not looking on LinkedIn, you're looking in the wrong place. On LinkedIn, 86% of small businesses get a qualified candidate within 24 hours. Hire professionals like a professional on LinkedIn. LinkedIn knows that small businesses are wearing a ton of hats and might not have the time or resources to hire. They're constantly finding ways to make the process easier. They even just launched a feature that helps you write job descriptions, making the process even easier and quicker. 2.5 million small businesses use LinkedIn for hiring. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNBA. That's linkedin.com/LockedOnNBA to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. All right, let's close this thing out here by talking a little bit about my overall prediction for the series. I think the Timberwolves will win on Saturday. I do. I think they'll win game 1. And for better or for worse, I think they'll do it playing mostly how they did for most of the regular season, and they're not going to allow themselves to be shoehorned into playing a different way. by Phoenix. And I think the Wolves will eke out a close win in game 1. Now, I think that will set them up for losing game 2 because I think they will say, hey, it worked in game 1. We'll keep doing the same thing. On a macro level, I'm sure they'll make some minor adjustments, but I think the rotation will be similar to what we saw on Sunday. I think they'll just play better. I think they'll play harder. I think the energy in the building will be awesome and even better in Target Center on Saturday. And I think Phoenix is probably a little overconfident at this point. I think the Wolves win Saturday. I worry about games 2 and 3 because I think Phoenix will do what they did for part of the regular season. They'll simply overwhelm the Wolves with their perimeter offense and they'll load up on Ant. The Wolves will stubbornly make no adjustments because, hey, we won game 1. I think they'll lose game 2. And then I think they'll lose game 3 as they try and figure out what those adjustments are. And I'm afraid the Wolves will be down 2-1 headed into game 4, which is still in Phoenix. But then I think they win a couple and I think they end up forcing, I think they win 4 and 5 and coming back to Target, or I guess game 6 would be back in Phoenix. So I think the Wolves will be up 3-2 going to game 6 in Phoenix. My overall prediction for the series is that the Wolves lose in 7 games. I think Phoenix wins a 7-game series. I do think it goes 7. And I would love, obviously, for the Wolves to win. And they certainly could win. I know they have home court in game 7, and I know that matters for the, more often than not. But I think when it comes down to game 7, it's what I worry about. There's a couple things. One, as much as I get tired of hearing about experience and this and that, because I think it totally can get overblown, it does matter in a situation like this. When the chips are down and there's adversity and it's the playoffs and it's uncharted territory for some of the guys, having a guy like Kevin Durant and even a guy like Devin Booker, I'm not including Bradley Beal in this because I just don't think I'm not worried about Bradley Beal in this series, and maybe he wins them a game. He was great on Sunday, obviously, but I'm more worried about Booker and Durant and the size, not the size overall, but like Nurkic, the way he plays, offensive rebounding, the chippiness of Grayson Allen and getting in the head of Karl-Anthony Towns, some of that stuff, right? The stuff we've covered this week. I'm not as worried about Bradley Beal. I think he's often been an overrated player overall. I think that Booker and Durant in a game 7 are going to make a big difference. And I worry a little bit about that. I also worry when it comes to coaching. Chris Finch is a fantastic coach, and I've been a Chris Finch defender, apologist, whatever. Shouldn't have to be an apologist when the guy wins 56 games and is, the all-star coach and first in the West for most of the season. But there's always people that want to rip the coaches. I think Chris Finch is a fantastic coach, and he deserves to be in the top 3 in Coach of the Year voting. He'll probably be second. But Frank Vogel's coached in, 88 playoff games? Yeah, 88 playoff games heading into this playoffs. Chris Finch has coached in 11. Frank Vogel's coached in 8 times as many playoff games as Chris Finch. And I think it actually matters more for coaches than it does for players. Because the macro adjustments you make over the course of a regular season and the game-to-game game planning, depending on your opponent, is different than an in-series tweak. And this, as I've stated ever since Monday's show, and actually going back to October, the Suns are a nightmare matchup for Minnesota. It's the worst possible matchup. Yes, there's holes the Wolves can exploit. They should be able to run. They should be able to turn the Suns over. They should be able to get a bunch of corner threes. They have a size advantage. They have home court advantage in this series. The matchup being what it is, and the Suns beating the Wolves in the fashion that they did in the regular season, well, unsustainable at that level, Chris Finch is going to have to make adjustments. And I don't know that Frank Vogel is a fantastic playoff coach. He's a great defensive coach, and people forget that. But that Pacers team that went to the conference, actually, I think he had 2 straight Pacers teams that went to the Eastern Conference Finals, and I think they both lost to LeBron. Those teams were, one of those was number 1 in defense. He had some really good defensive teams. The Lakers team that won the title a few years ago in the bubble, that was a good defensive team. He's a really good defensive coach. And I worry that the adjustments that Frank Vogel may come out on top. I think this is going to be a great series. It's very likely it goes 7. And at that point, it's basically a toss-up, and you might give the Wolves the edge because of home court. I just have a feeling the Suns pull it out. And they have the guys that have been there. They've been to the finals. They've won a title in Durant's case. And that's kind of how I think this thing will end up. I hope I'm wrong. I do hope it goes 7. I think that'd be a ton of fun. Although I wouldn't mind the Wolves winning a game 6 in Phoenix either. That'd be better. But This should be a ton of fun. I'm really excited for the series. As I said earlier, there's going to be a live postcast following the game on Saturday. I'm not sure who the guests will be, but Luke Inman will be hosting on Saturday. So tune into that live on Locked On Sports Minnesota on YouTube following the game on Saturday night. I will be back on Monday. We'll talk about Saturday's game. We'll set you up for Tuesday's game between Monday and Tuesday. Game 2 is not until Tuesday at 6:30 at Target Center. If you can't watch the game on Saturday, be sure to tune in on Locked On, or excuse me, on Sirius XM on the SXM app. Just search for Minnesota Timberwolves. You'll be able to hear the hometown call with our buddy Alan Horton calling every bucket for Wolves Suns game 1 on Saturday. And again, the live postcast on Locked On Sports Minnesota on YouTube following the game. So 5:30, 5:45-ish on YouTube. And then that audio will be posted here on the Locked On Wolves audio feed late on Saturday. That's all we have for you today here on the show. A big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every single day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere. That includes YouTube as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. Wherever you like to listen to podcasts, you can find Locked On Wolves. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. And you can follow on X at Locked On T-Wolves and also at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, CKEN. Of course, the Locked On Wolves podcast is part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Remember, the Locked On Network is your local experts on all the biggest stories. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast. We'll catch you next time. Enjoy game 1. We'll see you on Monday.